what I'm trying to say is that this argument about the theory of how nations come about goes back almost as far as the nation, right? So like it's very like, so the position that like nations aren't old, they're new, people have been saying that for more than 100 years, right? So like there has been, like national theorists will generally say like, oh, everyone who talks about the nation, they're stupid, you know, like they're unaware of like the fact that it's politically constructed. No. There's been awareness that it might be politically constructed for almost as long as there's been the nation itself. This discussion that we're having now has been going on for almost as long as the nation has existed. Oh, by the way, this Kellis Kraus guy, I mention him partly because he gives two interesting examples he gives two examples for his argument that the nation is all about modernity and not about tradition. And his example are the Jews and the Ukrainians. So at the time when he was writing, which was the early years of the 20th century, he died in 1905, so the very early years of the 20th century, the idea that Jews were a nation was generally seen as absurd because they lacked what were thought of then as the objective attributes of a nation. For example, territory, right? And so Jews can't be a nation. Ukrainians were thought not to be a nation because they lacked another objective attribute, which was a historical political class. Okay, so if your theory of the nation is that there is certain durable stuff like land or like a political class and that those make up the nation, then you look at the Ukrainians and the Jews in 1904 and you'd say, no, they're not nations. The Hungarians maybe, the Poles maybe, the Germans certainly, but not the Ukrainians and the Jews. What Kellis Kraus said is, think about it a different way, bracket what you think about the past, look at the way modernization affects people right now, and it turns out it doesn't matter, he argues, whether or not there are these quote-unquote objective attributes or not. All that matters is that modernization is going to generate the processes, the alienation, the urbanization, which are going to lead people to these new kinds of new forms of solidarity, right? And so when he said that the Jews and the Ukrainians were going to be modern nations in the early 20th century, that was a very radical argument, but it was consistent with a theory of the nation, which says that the nation is a result of modernization. Okay, so that ends the part about the theory of the nation. I want to close by talking about how some of our Ukrainians thought about the nation. So we've talked about the nation in general. We've talked about theories of the nation. Now we're going to talk about some of how the Ukrainians thought about the nation. And it's important to be clear that this whole thing is a very self-conscious process. The people who made nations knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. The way they talked about it might be a little different than how we would talk about it, but no one sleptwalked into nationhood. It didn't happen that way. There were larger processes in the background, I think. We can keep talking about this. I think the modernization people are right, that larger processes in the background, like urbanization, like capitalism, like literacy, made it likely that some new form of solidarity would emerge. Okay, but why, where, and for whom? Where and for whom, right? Why these nations and not other nations, right? So again, going back to the point I made at the beginning, nations mess with the past, right? Once they're created, they mess with the past. They make it very hard for people to process the past, right? It's like the periodic table is invented and then it says everybody do alchemy. They mess with the past. And one of the ways the nations mess with the past, maybe the most profound one, is that they convince everyone that their own existence is self-evident, right? So if you're in Poland and you grew up in the Polish educational system, many things might be uncertain, but the existence of Poland is not called into question, right? Even in the United States, where there's so many obvious contingencies, right? So many obvious contingencies. It's very difficult to argue that the United States had to be, that the revolution of 1776 had to happen, or that the Americans had to win, or in 1812 they had to win. I mean, they should have lost in 1812, or we, sorry, should have lost in 1812. The Louisiana Purchase, all this stuff, it obviously didn't have to happen, or the border with Canada, totally arbitrary. I don't mean that in an aggressive way. If there are any Canadians out there, it's cool. It's fine with me. But if you come to an American school system, like the existence of America isn't going to be called into question, right? The first class, no one's going to. The teacher's not going to say, by the way, America didn't have to be. Maybe it shouldn't have been. Maybe that would have been cool. What if the British Empire had been here longer? Maybe that would have been better. I'm going to guess that didn't happen in any of your classes, right? The nation. Okay, mate. All right. So we'll find out where you went to school. But the basic idea is that the nation makes itself self-evident. But it isn't, right? It isn't. So when we study Ukraine, we're going to be studying the formation of a political nation. But what I don't want you to think is, wow, Ukraine is really special because it's political and all the other nations are real. Right? That's the lesson that I don't want you to draw, right? I want you to think, this is interesting how the Ukrainian nation is maybe a little more self-consciously political, or maybe it's been forced into circumstances which reveal the political character of the nation to our eyes a little more clearly than with the French or the Americans or whatever. But I don't want you to think, oh yeah, the Ukrainians are kind of funky, but everyone else is has a rock solid tradition, right? I don't want you to think that. I want you to think, as we study the Ukrainian nation, we're going to see patterns which maybe actually help us to understand the Poles better, or the Russians better, or even the Americans and the British and the French better. Okay, so how did the Ukrainians think about themselves? In the 19th century, the main move in the Russian Empire, and don't worry, it's all going to become clear when the Russian Empire starts and when it ends and so on. For now, I just need you to know that in the 19th century, most people who spoke the Ukrainian language were in the Russian Empire. And in the Russian Empire in the 19th century, the second half, there was this idea of going to the people, which was called populism. So not populism in the sense that you're used to. Populism now means, I don't know what it means honestly, but it means something like, I'm not going to go down that road, but I don't mean when people say populism, they generally mean something that's not liberalism that we don't like. But populism in this sense meant going to the people and trying to figure out who the people were. It was a movement it was an urban movement in the Russian Empire associated with the science of what was then called ethnography that we now call anthropology, very influential in literature. Dostoevsky starts out being this way and then goes to prison and actually meets people and changes his mind about how great they are, which is an interesting story. So going to the people, right? And so one source of the Ukrainian national identity is this empirical contact with the people in the Russian Empire, where you realize, their folklore and their songs and their language are different, right? They're different. They just are different than the people further north, the people who we now call the Russians. And so you go to the people and you discover that the society, if you take it on its own terms, is just a little bit different, and you start thinking about that. That populism leads to something which we now call social history, where you locate the nation that's the Ukrainian historian who did this, where you locate the nation in its own self-understanding, in its customs, in its songs, in its stories, in its language. Okay, so in the 19th century, that's a very strong movement, and so you then say, okay, the nation has always been there, or it's been there for a really long time, but it's not politically represented, and that's the problem, right? That's the problem. So you're replacing the kinds of legitimating political stories we talked about before with a different political legitimating story. So it's not the Tsar or the Polish landlords who should control politics. It should be the people, right? Because they've been here for a long time, and look how numerous they are. And if you look at their customs, you can see that they're in fact a unity. Okay, that's populism, that's social history, that's going to the people. And of course, Mikhailo Hrushevsky wrote the very, very long history which justifies all this. There's a stage in the 19th century where you have to write a very long history in order to establish. I don't mean to make it sound like a joke because it's not easy, but you have to write a long history to document the continuity of the people, right? Where social history is in the foreground and the political history is in the background, and that's a radical reversal.